Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Kafav. Today's stuff is sponsored by the Hadron Zoom community in honor of Rabbi Michelle's recent birthday. As you taught us recently in Masechet Zvachim, Kol ha'ro'eh lebilah, bilah ma'akevet bo. Anything that's fit for mixing, the mixing is essential to it. By mixing the daf into our daily lives, you have transformed us, showing that we too are fit. We are honored to celebrate your birthday with you for the 6th time this cycle. Happy birthday. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor being your teacher. We're going to get started now with the Mishnah in Menachot. The Mishnah about 4 lines into our daf. Nitmeu shiareha, nisrafu shiareha, avdu shiareha. We have 3 cases here. If the shirayim, so we'll review this because we're going to talk about this, and something that I've said is basic today, we're going to see as a machloket. But normally what we've been saying until now is we take the solet, we put it in the bowl, we mix it up with the oil and whatever, we put some water in. That's our first thing. We call usually that the mincha. Then the Kohen takes out a kometz with his hand, puts the kometz in a sanctified vessel. That's the issue that's going to be debatable today. But until now we've understood, puts it in a sanctified vessel, brings it to the altar, burns it on the altar. Now what if after the stage of taking the kometz, the shirayim, now we're left, whatever's left in that original sanctified bowl, remember that was also sanctified. There's 2 sanctified bowls going on here. That's not what's important right now. What was left in that original sanctified bowl is called the shirayim, the remainder. If the remainder becomes impure before we burned the kometz, or burned or lost, kimidat Rabbi Eliezer kshera, ukimidat Rabbi Yehoshua psula. If we go with Rabbi Eliezer's approach, now we're referring to Rabbi Eliezer's approach in Zvachim, and kimidat Rabbi Yehoshua, or Rabbi Yehoshua's approach in Zvachim, in korbanot, then we're going to end up saying here, if we apply what they said there, that's why it's not that he says this, he says that, it's we're applying what they said by korbanot to Menachot. What did they say there, if you remember? There's dam afa pi she'ein basar, ve'basar afa pi she'ein dam. Remember? There's blood, even if you don't have the meat, you can still sprinkle the blood. That's Rabbi Eliezer. He says, if you're doing the sacrifice, you slaughter the animal, you're supposed to sprinkle the blood, then you burn the chelev and the yoteret hakaved and shtik klayot on the altar, and you eat the meat after that, right? That's what the blood permits. What if there's nothing for it to permit? What if there is no meat? What if there is no chelev? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, it doesn't matter. You can do the blood on its own. The blood is the important part. Whether there's anything left doesn't really matter. So again, obviously, after we sprinkle the blood, there's no question. It doesn't really matter if anything happens to the meat, but we're talking about what if it happens before. Are you allowed to sprinkle the blood when there's no meat? And Rabbi Yehoshua says, im ein basal, ein dam. Okay? It doesn't work. Okay? If there's no meat, you can't sprinkle the blood. So basically, they say the exact same thing here. It's the comparison. You're supposed to burn the kometz. That permits the shirayim. If there's no shirayim, then there's no burning, according to Rabbi Yehoshua. According to Rabbi Eliezer, just like you could do the blood without the meat, you could do the kometz without the shirayim. That's the Mishnah. So the first thing we do is we have Rav. Rav comes and says, I'm a Rav. Vehu shenitmeu kol shiareha. He says, by the way, this is only if all of the shirayim became impure. Where Rabbi Yehoshua is going to say this doesn't work. Miksat shiareha lo. But if it's just some of the shirayim, then that's not a problem. Okay, the first thing we have to deal with Rav is not really the part that you probably focused on, which is most of rather than all of. Okay, but we're going to get back to that. But the first thing they're going to focus on is he said nitmeu. Now there were 3 cases in the Mishnah. Became impure, it got lost, or burned. Rav only makes mention of tuma. Okay, nitmeu. So kasal kadatach, they thought, which is usually an indicator that that's not going to be the case in the end, but they thought nitma'in avu v'saruf lo. He wouldn't say the same about avu v'saruf. What would he say about avu v'saruf? Rabbi Yehoshua wouldn't permit it. If it got lost or burnt, no. Only if it became impure. Now we're going to have to figure out, okay, well, what's the logic to make a distinction? And basically they're going to prove there's really no logic. And then they're going to say, it must be he meant all 3 and only just mentioned one of them. But right now they're going to try to come up with a logic for making a distinction between avu v'saruf versus tameh, and it's going to bring us back to the tzitz, obviously, because that's where tumah has its own unique properties. But let's start. My kasavar. So what did Rav hold if he was really making this distinction? Ika savar shiura miltahi. If you say remainder is significant, right? Because if you have, this is actually a tricky word, shiura is a remainder of the remainder, right? Because the whole thing was a remainder to begin with. But the question is, if you have part of the remainder left and it's not the whole remainder, is that significant or not? So, kasal kadatach nitma'in avu v'saruf lo. And then, I just went back for a second. Ika savar shiura milti, if you think shiura is significant, then afilu avu v'saruf nami, then it shouldn't matter whether it was lost or burned or impure. It should all be the same. As long as you have some left, that should work. Ika savar, now what's the other option? Maybe shiura is lav milti. Now, if you're going to say, well, the remainder of the remainder is completely insignificant, then nitma my time. And now, what possible reason could you have for saying, however, we're going to let it go in the case of the tuma, as long as you have a little bit left? Remember, but if you have nothing left, then no. Well, what would be the only possible reason? As I said before, the tzitz is the only thing that differentiates between tuma and anything else. Because remember, we spent a lot of time on it yesterday. The tzitz only atones for tuma, not for anything else. So you would say demirat tzitz. That would be the reason. But if you're going to say the ritzoi of the tzitz permits this to be burned without, right? Just if the rest of it's impure, right? If most of it got impure, but there's a little bit left, so the tzitz will permit this. Now, what does the tzitz permit? The tzitz permits the tuma part. Well, then, ihachi kol shirayim anami. Then it shouldn't matter. If all the shirayim became impure, then Rabbi Yehoshua should allow it because of the tzitz, right? Then the tzitz basically deals with the fact that there was impurity here and allows things to go as they are. So it doesn't make any sense to say, well, if all of them became impure, you can't do it. But if some of them, there's a little bit left, that's fine. That doesn't make sense. If it's the tzitz, it shouldn't matter, all or some. So that didn't work either. So this whole theory didn't work. Le'olam, so they're going to say, as I said in the beginning, le'olam kasavar shiura milti. Okay, really, remainder is significant. As long as you have some of the remainder left, remember, we're talking about the remainder of the remainder, some of the shirayim left, then what's the reason? V'nitma v'huadin lavu v'saruf. Okay, when he said nitma, he didn't mean only nitma. He meant, of course, the threesome. To nitma, nevad, nischaf. Okay, where it got lost, burned, or impure. Now, haidikamer nitma, now you have to explain, why did he only say nitma? Because reshai hu nakit. Because he just took the first one on the list. Okay, I see from your question that something wasn't clear, so let me clarify. This track is now saying this has nothing to do with the tzitz. All this means is, and we're going to prove it now in a minute, so if you didn't get it, you'll get it right now, which is you can't do, okay, let's say the blood, we're going to see this in korbanot, if there's no meat, and you can't do the burning of the kometz if there's no shirayim, but if you have a little bit left, okay, whether the rest got lost, the rest got burnt, the rest got impure, as long as you have a little bit left, that little bit is significant. Okay, usually we say as long as there's a kizayit, and that we're going to see in a minute with the korbanot. So as long as there's something left, this has nothing to do with the tzitz at all. The tzitz was if you go with the other option. The shirayim really doesn't count, but because of the tzitz will allow impurity. That didn't work. So we're back to saying it really includes all three. So now we basically reread Rav. I'm going back to the first line of the Gemara. Amarav v'hu shenitmeu or nisrafu or nevdu kol shireha. But miktsat, if you still have a little bit left, then Rabbi Yehoshua will agree that you can go ahead and do it. And now we're going to see this all in Kiddutanya, as it says in a braitot, which is actually in the Tosefta, and we've seen this a number of times in Shas already, this source, and recently as well. Rabbi Yehoshua omer, kol hazvachim shebetorah, shenishtayer mehen kazayit basal, o kazayit chelev, zorek et adam. Any zvachim in the Torah, where you're left with, okay, so again, what happened? You slaughtered, you haven't yet sprinkled the blood, and the meat gets lost, but you're left with kizayit basal, either an olive bulk of the meat, or kizayit chelev, or an olive bulk of the forbidden fats, which again, what happens to the fats? They get burned on the altar, okay? So either meat that's going to get eaten, or chelev that's going to get burned. These are two things, by the way, that the blood permits. So if you're left with a kizayit of that one or that one, zorek et adam, you can still sprinkle the blood. This exactly proves, this is Rabbi Yehoshua, and it's saying, right, it started with Rabbi Yehoshua Omeil, and it's saying that as long as there's something left, an olive bulk, you can go ahead and do the blood. And that's why Rav said, based on that, we're going to say the same thing by the kometz. But he says, we're going to keep just reading this Tosefta. If you have half a kazayit of chaylev and half kazayit of meat, since they don't combine because the meat gets eaten and the chaylev gets burned, so that doesn't help you. You have to have a full shear of one or the other. Or both, obviously, but a full shear altogether, of each. Uba ola, now in a korban ola where everything gets burned, so in that case, since the whole thing gets burned, even if you have a half of the meat and a half of the fats, since all that stuff gets burned together on the altar, they do combine in a case of a korban ola. Uve mincha, you might remember this line, afilu kula kayemat lo yischok. And in a mincha, even if the whole thing is left, the entire mincha, you can't sprinkle the blood. Okay, this is super confusing. What blood is there to sprinkle with a mincha? And every time we bring the source, we ask this question, mincha maya vidata, what does the mincha have to do here? What does the mincha have to do is zrikat dam, and what does it even mean? Right? Even if it was the mincha, it doesn't make any sense. If the whole thing is left, even if the whole thing's left, you can't do it. What do you mean? If the whole thing's left, it should be good. So Amar Papi explains that last line, minchat nisachim. What are we talking about? We're talking about a korban, an animal sacrifice, that you lost all the meat, you lost all the chaylev, you have nothing left of the animal. But what do you have? You have the mincha that goes with it. Remember, there's the libations that go along with the korban. So you are left with the mincha. So you might have thought, you might have thought, since this mincha is brought together with the sacrifice, maybe so you don't have any meat of the animal left, but you still have the mincha, which is an accessory to it. Maybe that would be enough to permit you to sprinkle the blood of the animal sacrifice. And what the braitot, the Tosefta is telling you is, no, that's something external. Yes, it's an accessory, but it's an external accessory. That doesn't allow you to sprinkle the blood of the korban. Okay, that was a side point. Now the Gemara wants to know, what's the source for this? Okay, this is a good example. It's a good time to bring you a little tip in when you're learning Gemara. The Gemara asks, what's the basis for this? What's the basis for what? We said a lot of things in the last few minutes. So what are we talking about? So if you look in Rashi helps you, okay? Often when you have a Menachot and you're like, what are they asking about? Because we said a lot of things. So, sometimes you could just go ahead and figure out by what they say ahead. But if you want to know before you go ahead what it is, you can look at Rashi. Rashi says, Di'im lo nishtayer basar el chaylev zoreket adam. This is one point that we mentioned, a very side point, which is why it was a little confusing. Think about what they were asking. That if you don't have meat left, you don't need meat, even chaylev is enough to say that you can sprinkle the blood. Okay? How do we know that the chaylev is important enough that you can sprinkle the blood if all that's left is chaylev and no meat? Okay, that's the question. So what's our source for this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yishmael umatabu mishum Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. So Rabbi Yochanan either said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael or in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, B'iktir achelev l'reach nichoach la'Hashem. Okay, you have to really read the beginning of the pasuk. Okay, I'm going to read you the whole pasuk. It's in Vayikra Yud Zayin 17, verse 6. V'zarak HaKohen et Adam al Mizbach Hashem. The Kohen sprinkles the blood on the Mizbeach of God. Petach Ol Moed, the entrance to Ol Moed. V'iktir achelev l'reach nichoach la'Hashem. And then he burns the chelev for a pleasant smell before God. So what do they say here? Because it says the chelev right next to the dam, chelev afal pi she'en basal. So there you see the chelev is significant, that when you're sprinkling the blood, there needs to be chelev left. Or if there's chelev left, even if there's no blood, even if there's no meat, that will permit the sprinkling of the blood. Okay, so now they say, fine, eshkechan chelev, I get chelev. But yoteret u'shtei klayot minala. And how do we know these are other parts that get burned? Okay, the yoteret and the shtei klayot, the lobe of the liver and the two kidneys. How do you know that if there's no chelev left, there's no meat left, but those two are left, how do you know that? What's the source in the Torah for this? Now, it's actually an interesting structure here. Before they tell you the source in the Torah for it, they have to tell you first, where do we even know that if that's left, you can sprinkle the blood? We didn't talk about that. All we talked about was meat and chelev. So before they answer the minalan question, what's the source in the Torah for it, first they're going to show us what's the Tanaitic source where we know that you can actually still sprinkle the blood if that's all that you have left. And they're going to darshan it, or infer it, I should say, from the Tosefta that we read. What does it say in the Tosefta? It says, chelev and basar, those are left, you can sprinkle the blood. And then it says, when can't you sprinkle the blood? If the mincha is left, the libation, which is external. So they say, mincha, you can't sprinkle the blood if all you have left is the mincha. What can you infer from there? That's the point of no return, right? That's the point where you're stuck. Mincha hu de lo yizrok. But but as long as you have something left from the animal, which is right, it's in between the chaylev and the meat, and on the other side you have the mincha. So what's in between? Well, because it says mincha, you can't do it. If that's the only thing left, it sounds like anything less than that, or more that you have anything more than that left, like things having to do with the animal, you can. Now, why is your teret and shtei klayot different from chaylev? Because the pasuk only says chaylev. That's the point. So how do we get from that pasuk? It sounds like maybe only chaylev and not the yoteret and the shtei klayot. So now they prove from the Tosefta that for sure, if the yoteret and shtei klayot were left yizurok. So now they go back and they ask the question, so minalam, where do we get it from that pasuk? Or from anywhere in the Torah, but we're going to actually get it from the pasuk. So Rabbi Yochanan Didei Amar. Now Rabbi Yochanan himself said, why are they telling you himself? Because before the first source about the chaylev, he quoted someone else. We weren't sure who he quoted, but he quoted the name of someone else. Now he himself brought the second drasha on the yoteret and the shtei klayot. So he said, l'reach nichach. That pasuk says, the chaylev you bring l'reach nichach for a pleasing smell in front of God. So it says here, kol she'atam aleh l'reach nichach. Anything that you put on the altar for a pleasing aroma, that's going to be as well. So that's like the yoteret and the shtei klayot, because it also offers a pleasing aroma when you put them on the altar. So therefore, anything like that that's left permits the sprinkling of the blood. Okay? I just want to point out here, we've gotten completely sidetracked from our topic of the kometz, right? Our topic is the mincha and the kometz. But the Gemara, because the Mishnah already compared it to this whole machloket about Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer, about the sacrifices, Rav then says, yeah, and it's completely comparable. As long as there's a kazayit left, Rabbi Yehoshua even permits it. Then we got into where do we see that he permits it when it comes to the meat and the chaylev and the yoteret and shtei klayot. From there, we just got off on a whole sugya and zvachim, really, not really having to do with our topic. Now, itzrich lemichtav chaylev, the last part of this before we get to the next Mishnah. Why did the pasuk have to say also chaylev and also the reich nichach? Why couldn't it have said one and that would have included both? So you need chaylev and itzrich lemichtav the reich nichach. Why? The ikatav chaylev hava mina chaylev in yoteret shtei klayot lo. That we already know. If it had just said chaylev, you would have thought just chaylev. The fact that they say l'reich nichach comes to include the others as well. So why don't you just say reich nichach, which was a general term which would have included everything? Well, even the libation, which is external, but it has a pleasing aroma. So you might have thought that maybe that's included as well, and that permits the blood to be sprinkled. Therefore, katar rachman chaylev, they said no. They said chaylev together with reich nichach, so that teaches you it has to be something, the reich nichach, that's similar to chaylev, that comes from the animal itself. Okay, and thus ends that sugya. Now we're going to start with a Mishnah that has two parts, and the Gemara is going to deal with each part separately, as is usual. They're two completely different halachot, and then the Gemara is going to get off a little bit on other things. Shelo b'klei sharet pasul, the Rabbi Shimon machshir. Here we get the big kind of different opinion. I think we actually quoted it before. I'm just looking. Yeah, it was in Zvachim Yud Aleph. Okay, it was a while ago. So now we're going to see that there's a machlok of Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about does the kometz need to be in a kli sharet? Okay, remember, first the whole dough is in a kli sharet, so it's already sanctified. Kohen puts his hands in, right? Takes a handful, puts it in a vessel to sanctify the kometz. But this kometz theoretically was already sanctified before. So we're going to see there's a machloket about whether you really need to put it in that sanctified vessel or not, and if you didn't, is it disqualified or not? So the rabbi says it's completely disqualified. If you didn't put the kometz in that second sanctified vessel, it's no good. Rabbi Shimon machshir, Rabbi Shimon says it's fine. Second halacha, hiktir kumtza pa'amayim kshera. If you burn the kometz in two installments, why would you do that? Well, once you burn it, it's burnt. So it must be you split it in two, burnt one part, and then burnt the other. It works. Okay, we'll get back to that later. So what we're going to do in this whole part of the sugya, which is going to take us a while, is Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Why does he permit it not going into the sanctified vessel? That's obviously the outlier opinion, because until now we keep talking about that it goes in that vessel after. So we're going to have three opinions as to why Rabbi Shimon holds this way, three different opinions, and we're going to have difficulties raised from braitot against the different opinions. Amar Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia. My time at Rabbi Shimon. Amar Ka. right? What's his reason? The pasuk says, Kodesh Kodeshim hi kachatat kasham. We've seen this before. The mincha is it's a holy, right? The higher sanctified holiness. Kodesh Kodeshim instead of Kodeshim Kalim, the higher level sanctity. Like a chatat and like an asham. Okay, in what way is it like a chatat and like an asham? What are they trying to tell you? Well, there's actually two ways you could do it. Balo ovda biyad, if you want to do it by hand, that already means you don't have to do it with a kli. Then kechatat, ovda biyamin kechatat. Then you do it with your right hand like a sin offering. Remember the sin offering? It says taval etzba'o badam. We had a whole thing about it. Etzba'o, anytime it says etzba and kohen, that means it has to be right hand. So if you're doing it by hand, which means obviously you can do it by hand, okay, and that's where we get it from because it's done like the chatat. If you do it by hand, then it has to be like the chatat. You have to do it with your right hand. Okay, so you don't need a vessel. Bikli ovda b'smol ke'asham. If you do it in a vessel, then you can actually do the avoda, meaning carrying it to the altar, putting it on the altar, burning it on the altar. You could do that with your left hand. Why? Because the asham doesn't require left hand. Okay, this is because it doesn't say etzba by asham. When you go sprinkle the blood, how do you sprinkle the blood of the asham? It's in a cup, and you throw it onto the side of the altar from the cup. And if you did that while you were holding it in your left hand, it's actually fine. So what do we see from here? We see there's two tracks. You could do it by hand, or you could do it in a vessel. Either way is an option, and that's all darshan from this pasuk. How could it be like a chata and like an asham? It must be in one way it's like a chata, and in one way it's like an asham, and there you see. Okay, that's Rabbi Shimon. Second opinion, Rabbi Yana Amal, kevan shekmatzo mikli sharet, maleo maktiro afilu behemyano afilu b'mkedash al cheges. He says, listen, you took already the kometz from the first sanctified vessel. That's the obvious reason for Rabbi Shimon. It was already sanctified. From there, once you take the kometz in your hand, right? So you have to do that by hand. You can carry it in your belt or your robe, right? Like sometimes you roll up your shirt to hold something if you don't have any other way to hold it. So you could carry it like that to the altar and put it on the altar from there. You could put it in a earthenware vessel, which is not a sanctified vessel. Okay, so it's fine because it was all sanctified already from the beginning. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Hakol modim b'kometz sheta'un kiddush. Okay, he says something that really doesn't make much sense at first. He says, even Rabbi Shimon agrees you need to put in a vessel. Okay, well that's weird. What did we say? Shelo b'klei sharet Rabbi Shimon machshir. So what does he mean? If you have to put it in, then it's not going to be good. What he means is, stage one, it's in that vessel. Take out the kometz, put it in a sanctified vessel. But until now, what we thought, and this is what the rabbi's position is, you have to take that vessel. In the vessel, you have to carry it to the altar. You have to put it to burn it straight from the vessel. But Rabbi Shimon says, no, it has to go in that vessel, but for a second or a minute or, not a lot of time. If you want to take it out of the vessel after you sanctify it, and as everyone agrees it has to be sanctified by putting it in that vessel. But then you can move on and take it by hand and bring it to the altar by hand and do the rest of it by hand. So that's a third opinion, which actually is a completely different understanding of Rabbi Shimon. We're going to start with our slew of questions. We're going to have, I think it's 4 sources that contradict. The first one, Rabbi Yehuda, the next 3, Rav Nachman, and then we're going to go back a little bit and say maybe some of these raise difficulties with the others. Okay? So let's go. First question, Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, we have to review each time what he says. He says, Kachata kasham, if you do it by hand, you have to do it with yamin. If you do it by vessel, you could do yamin or small. Well, look at this source. Hekter chalavim ve'evarim. Okay, first it starts with something else, burning the chalev and the body parts of the ola on the altar, and eitzim, and the wood. Shehe'elan bein biyah bein b'kli. You could bring them to the altar in a vessel, you could bring them to the altar by hand. Bein biyamin bein b'smol, you could bring them to the altar by hand, or by right or left hand. Ksherim, right? If you did them in any way, it's all kasher. HaKometz v'aktoret, here's our point, the kometz, and the ktoret, and the levona. Shehe'elan bein biyah bein b'kli, bein biyamin bein b'smol ksherim. What do you see here? To Rabbi Yehuda braid Rabbi Chia, because it says here, you could bring them whether you want biyad or b'kli, and you could do it with right or left. He said, no, it depends. If you do it biyad, you could do it only with yamin. Only b'kli, it doesn't really matter. So this seems to contradict. This seems to say every permutation is possible. He doesn't think that. To which the Gemara is going to say, no, Amar lecha Rabbi Yehuda braid Rabbi Chia, he could say to you, litzdadim katane. I read that litzdadim, meaning, ba b'yamin b'kli, bein b'yamin, bein b'small. I'm sorry, did I read that right? Biyad b'yamin, b'kli, bein b'yamin, bein b'small. He said, no, it says bein b'yad, bein b'kli, bein b'yamin, bein b'small. So how do I read this? Well, biyad, it has to be yamin. If it's bikli, bein biyamin, bein bismol. So it's not exactly the simple reading, but it's a possible way of reading it. Litzdadim means each one in its own way. So there's biyad, bikli, and then each one has its own track. Tashma. First difficulty of Rav Nachman, like I said, we're going to have 3. So Rav Nachman is the one who says it really does require a kli sharet. So now we're going to see all these sources that don't seem to think that Rabbi Shimon requires a kli sharet at all. Kometzo shalomi kli sharet, v'kidsho shalo b'kli sharet. If you took the kometz not from a kli sharet, meaning there was no kli sharet in the beginning, or kidsho shalo b'kli sharet, or you didn't put it in a kli sharet after you took the kometz out, v'helo v'ktiro shalo b'kli sharet, and then you brought it to the altar and burned it not in a sanctified vessel. This is actually either one of those you didn't do. Okay, not that you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't do that. If you didn't do the first one, or you didn't do the second stage, or it wasn't a kli sharet stage 3, pasul. That's Tanakama. Here comes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon, and that's what interests us, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon machshirim b'matan kli. Now, in Tanakama talked about a kli sharet. They say as long as you put it in a vessel, it's fine, meaning it doesn't even need a sanctified vessel. So, how do we resolve this? It sounds like it doesn't need a kli at all. But they say no. Ema mi matan kli va'elach. Don't say machshirim b'matan kli. Machshirin mi matan kli. From once it was in the vessel. Meaning as long as you put it in the vessel originally, and when you had the kometz, you don't have to have it in the vessel to go put it on the altar. Okay? So that's a different way of reading it to resolve the difficulty. Tashma, second difficulty of Rav Nachman. V'chachamim omrim, kometz ta'un kli sharet. Kometz needs kli sharet. This is the rabbis. We know this, obviously. Ketzad. Komtsomi kli sharet, mekacho b'kli sharet, malo maktiro b'kli sharet. Same 3 stages. Take it out of a kli sharet, right? Then you have to put it in again to a kli sharet, the kometz. Then you have to bring it to the altar and burn it in a kli sharet. Rabbi Shimon omer, kevan shekmatzo mi kli sharet, since you already took it from the kli sharet, meaning kli number 1, malo maktiro shelo b'kli sharet. You can do, it's actually funny, because, well, not interesting. There's 3 stages, right? Taking it out, that's stage 1. That's what he talks about. And then stage 3 is burning it and putting it on the altar, right? Bringing it to the altar and putting it on. What about the stage of kometz? Doesn't really talk about. That's the tricky part here, or that's where we're going to have a reason for an answer. But it sounds like he's saying as long as you took it from a kli sharet originally, and then you can just bring it to the altar and burn it without a kli sharet. So it sounds like you don't need to put the kometz into a kli sharet because it doesn't say that. And vidayo, and that's sufficient. So Ema, how are we going to correct this? Obviously what I already kind of mentioned, which is they kind of miss stage 2 in there. So they say like this. The way you read the first part is, Kevan shekmatzel v'kidsho b'kli sharet. Since you already did the kometz and put it in a kli sharet, then you can do stage 3, ma'alo maktiro v'dayo. Then stage 3 doesn't need to be in a kli sharet anymore, and then that fits perfectly with Rav Nachman. Tashma, third source against Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, and fourth source in general that we brought here. Kamatz bimino v'natam b'smono lechzir yimino. If you did the kmitza with your right hand, and the kohen puts it in his left hand, he just puts it back in his right hand and fixes it. Bismolo, if he did it, I'm turning out on the bed, if while it was still, he did the kmitza with his right, put it in his left, and while it's in his left hand, chishev aleha. He had a machshava that, right, that what? He's going to do it. Now we get into pigul. Ben chutz l'mkomo, ben chutz l'zmano. I'm going to burn this or eat the remainder outside of the right place or outside of the right time. Pasul ve'ein bo karet. Because it was in his left hand, yes, it's disqualified, but no, there's no karet associated with it because it was in his left hand at the time. But you have to add a word biyamino and take out the letters lamed aleph. If it's biyamino when he did it, chishev aleh chutz l'mkomo. He thought chutz l'mkomo pasul ve'ein bo karet. Because chutz l'mkomo, if you think you're going to do it outside the time, it's never karet, okay? But chutz l'zmano, that's the classic pigul v'chayavim alav karet, because you did it while it was in your right hand. Okay, this doesn't really seem connected yet, but hold off. So that's divrei Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Shimon. Okay, this is what they say. Chachamim omrim, kevan shenetano l'smol, pisalto matanto. He says you completely disqualified it for that 1 second. It was in the left hand, completely disqualified. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is understand the rabbis, and from there we're going to have a difficulty on Rabbi Shimon. There's a difficulty on Rav Nachman's understanding of Rabbi Shimon. My taima mishum debai kedusha b'kli v'kevan shenetano l'smol naaseh kedam shenishpach mitzavar behema ala ritzpa v'asafos shabasu. This all explains, by the way, why Zvachim comes before Menachot, because you never understand Menachot if we had to learn all the Zvachim all over again. But this is something we learned in Zvachim. The blood has to go straight from the animal into the vessel. If it falls on the floor first, it's no good. So now, what do we have here? Well, there's no spurt coming out. What's the coming out? It's the kometz, putting it in the Kohen's hands. But it has to go straight from the Kohen's hands into the vessel. As soon as it goes into the left hand, it's as if it fell on the floor. And when it falls on the floor for the blood, you can't collect it and put it back in the vessel. It's too late. You ruined it. Just like here. If you put it in the left hand, according to the rabbis, it's completely ruined because it had to go straight to the vessel and it didn't. It went from the right, in the right hand, they have no choice. I mean, that's how you take the kometz. From there, it's supposed to go straight into the vessel. It stops somewhere along the way. That's like falling on the right, somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be. It's like falling on the floor. Now, what do you see from here? Why do Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer think that it's okay that it went into small? Because Michlal do Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon lo ba'u matan kli. Because they don't think you need a vessel. And that's why they don't have this halacha. Well, if it fell on the floor before the vessel, or if it got into your left hand before the vessel, this doesn't even need a vessel. If it needed a vessel, it would be a problem. Tiyufta de Rav Nachman tiyufta. So this actually is a difficulty for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, because it really sounds like Rabbi Shimon doesn't require a kli. So now they're going to say, okay, and we'll finish up this part of the sugya by bringing this source back to the other two opinions. And then we'll come full circle and we'll review the opinions. Rabbi Yehuda berei de Rabbi Chia, who said what? If you do it biyad, right, then you need right hand. Well, that actually fits perfectly because what does this show? It needs the right hand. When you do it biyad, here Rabbi Shimon was talking about doing it biyad. You moved it into the left hand. You just put it back in the right hand, and then you're fine. So he didn't mind that it went temporarily into the left hand because there's no requirement of kli. All it just needs is right. Okay, so you moved it into left, put it back in the right, and that fits perfectly. But to Rabbi Yanai, it's a problem because what did Rabbi Yanai say? Rabbi Yanai said, even in your belt, even mikedash al cheres. If that's the case, he obviously wouldn't require small at all, right? He wouldn't require yamin. If you can stick it in your clothes, you don't need to have it in your left hand. So why would you have to put it back into your right hand? So that doesn't make any sense because as long as you take the kometz with you right after that, it could be in anything. It doesn't need to be in your right hand. So it sounds like it's a difficulty. However, Amal Rabbi Yana, we have an answer. Ana de Amre Katana de Hekter. Vilav Litzadim Katan. Okay. Now we're going to go back and say that to resolve this problem with the contradiction between this braitot and Rabbi Yana's position, it really does contradict. But Rabbi Yana can say, but I have a different source that supports my reading. And then the way it works is, if you can bring someone who supports your opinion, you could say, there's a machloket between the braitot and I hold by this one. Now, which braitot? The one that we explained litzdadin, we can explain not litzdadin. Which one was that one? Okay, it's hard to keep this all in your head. It was the first one we brought as a contradiction. Hekter chalavim, right? And then let's just go back to the second part because the chalavim don't interest us. The kometz, the ktoret, and the lavona, okay? The ktoret, the kometz, which is our part, right, from the mincha. The incense and the frankincense. She'elan, bein biyad, bein bekli, bein beyamin, bein besmol. There you have it. That's my source, says Rabbi Yanai. That's where I get my opinion from. It's so clear here that Rabbi Shimon doesn't require any requirements about not bekli and not, beyamin or small. And that's, so don't quote me the other braitot. This is the one I hold by. Now, I want to say something else about this. I forgot, but no, I guess that's it. Okay, so there we finish this section. Now we move on. Hiktir kumtza pa'amayim kshera. So now we have, if you burn the kometz in two separate times, okay, you split it in half, burn this, then burn that, it's fine. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, pa'amayim velo pa'amei pa'amayim. He says, yeah, 2 parts, not 3, not 4, okay, just 2. Rabbi Yochanan amar pa'amayim va'afilu pa'amei pa'amayim. Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you mean? You could do 2, 3, 4, it doesn't matter. It could be in as many parts as you want. So the Gemara asks, my benadu, okay, what's the root of this machloket? Amar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera explains, Yesh kometz pachot mishnei zitim, v'yesh haktara pchuta mishnei zitim ika benadu. They have a machloket about whether a kometz could be less than 2 olive bulbs, and whether you can burn something less than an olive bulb, and that will be considered a burning. Okay, let's explain. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi Safal, Ein kometz pchuta mishnei zitim. There's no such thing as a kometz that's less than 2 zitim. Okay, it has to be minimum 2 olive bulbs. I think I said it in the wrong language before. What I meant it right. Is there a kometz? Could a kometz be less than 2 zitim? Maybe I said it right. I don't remember. Right? Could it or not? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, no way could it be less than 2 zaytim. Minimum is 2 zaytim. Now, if you have 2 zaytim, and that's what the Mishnah is talking about, then if you split it in two, what do you end up with? 1 zayit, 1 zayit. And what he's really saying is, that's the reason why it needs a minimum of 2 zayit, or the Mishnah is kind of teaching you, ein haktara pchuta mikazayit. There's no such thing as burning less than a kazayit. So therefore, when the Mishnah said you could split it in two, since the minimum shear for a kometz is 2 zaytim, so you can do it in two separate actions. But you can't take 2 olive bulbs and do it in 3. Now the commentaries say, what if there were actually 3? So then he says, then you could do it in 3. So he's not saying you can't ever split it into more than 2, but what he's saying is if there's only 2 olive bulbs or less than 3, you can't split it up into more than 2 parts because you can't burn less than a kazayit. Rabbi Yochanan savar, yesh kometz pachot mishne zaytim, v'yesh haktara pchuta mikazayit. You can have a kometz less than 2 zaytim. So when the Mishnah said you can split it in 2, since there's such a thing as a kometz less than 2 zayits, if you were to split that into 2, you would end up with less than a kazayit. So he says it obviously doesn't matter how much you burned at a time, as long as ultimately you burn the amount you're supposed to burn, you burn the whole, which is the whole kometz. You could do it in 4 times, 5 times, doesn't make a difference to him. Okay, Itmar. Now, so that was dealing with our Mishnah. We dealt with part 1, which was Rabbi Shimon's opinion about the not requiring the vessel. 3 opinions about what that was, right? What the basis for his reason was, and even the third one had a bit of a different understanding of Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Brought different braitot to contradict. Then, but resolved them, or didn't. Some were left as questions to some of the opinions. Then we moved on to this Pa'amayim and what really this machloket is between these 2 Amoraim about understanding the Mishnah. Is it 2 or is it more than 2? Itmar. Now we get into something else. Kometz me'ematay matir shirayim b'achila. When you burn the kometz on the altar, well, what stage of the burning are the shirayim permitted? So the Kohen standing there watching it burn, when can he start eating the shirayim? What's the mincha that's left? Rabbi Chanina amar mishamashla bo eta'ol. Once the fire catches onto it, even though it doesn't burn most of it. Rabbi Yochanan amar mishatatzit bo ha'or berubo. It has to mostly be already affected by the fire. Okay, the majority of it, not just a little bit. So Amar le Rav Yehuda le Rabbi Bar Rav Yitzchak Ezra al Achtama de Rabbi Yochanan. I'm going to bring you Rabbi Yochanan's reason why it says the majority. Amar Kra v'hinei ala kitor haaretz ki kitor kivshan. Okay, there's a pasuk in the destruction of stone, and it says the kitor haaretz. So that's the language of haktara, of burning, went up like the kitor. Right, there was smoke coming up like the smoke of a furnace. Now, it talks about burning, and it talks about smoke of a furnace. Now, when does smoke of a furnace come up? Until the majority of the furnace is the fire gets to the majority of the furnace, it's not going to start smoking like the first minute, right? It takes time for the smoke to come up. So that's where he gets the definition for burning of the kometz. Now we're going to have a difficulty, okay? Amar le Ravin bar Rav Ada le Rav. Amri Tamidach Amar Rav Amram. So Ravin bar Ada says to Rav, your student said in the name of Rav Amram, Tanya, they brought this braitot. Now, before we start the braitot, you have to understand what pasuk they're darshaning. Zot Torat ha'olah. This is the rules for the olah. Hi ha'olah mukdal mizbeach. This goes on the mizbeach. Kol halayla ad haboker. From the night, all the night until the morning. Okay. Now, I'm not going to read the end. It's not important. Now, ein li ela dvarim shedarkan likareh balayla. This sounds like what goes on at night. Things that generally go on at night. Now, you might remember you don't really do avodah at night. The only thing you do is you burn the parts of the olah, right, or the parts of the sacrifices that need to be burned, like the chaylev and the oteret that we talked about today, all that stuff. Kigon evarim updarim, like the parts of the korban olah, for example. Shema alanu miktira mi bo hashemesh umitaklim v'olchim kol halayla kulo. So you burn them from the beginning of the night, like from when the sun sets, okay, and they stay on there all night and burn. Dvarim shedarkan likarev bayom, but there's things that have to be burned during the day, like our case, the kometz, kigon kometz, v'alavona, v'aktoret. All these things are things that are burnt on the altar, and they're not the parts of the olah that can go at night. They all have to be done during the day. So those things, now here's a very confusing line. You put them on and burn them from when the sun sets. Okay, that sounds exactly like the first one, and these are supposed to be done during the day. So the Gemara stops the braitot in the middle and says, what are you talking about? How can you possibly say you can burn them at night when we just said you have to burn them during the day? Ela im bo hashemesh. What does that mean? Just before the sun sets, you can put them on the altar. So as long as it hasn't set yet, You have you can put it just at the very last minute. As long as it was put on during the day, you can let it burn all night. So all it needs to do is to be put there for a second before the sun sets. How do you know? Now we're back to the braitot. How do you know that they can be left to burn all night? It included not only the ola, but it included other things as well. Anything that's meant to be burnt during the day, as long as you put it before, when it was still daytime, then it can continue to go. Now we're going to see the problem. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who said you have to have the or catch on the whole thing for it to be considered that you burnt it, to permit the shiraim, you're not going to have a case where the or got to the majority of it in that split second before sunset. So they say, lo kasha, these are two different issues. Kan liklot, kan latil. One is, do we call this that the mizbech, it absorbed it for the moment, that it's considered that you put it on during the day and it can now be left to continue at night? That's one thing. Whether it permits the shirayim or not, that's a later stage. These two things are not connected. That's answer number one. Answer number two is to say, Rabbi Eliezer, matne la mi bo hashemesh. Okay, he goes back and explains it differently. So what does it mean, mi bo hashemesh? He's not talking about you could put it on after sunset. What he's talking about is you could put something on after sunset. Not the ketoret and the kometz, but poking. What does that mean? Mokim la b'poking. He says, if you put the kometz, the lavona, the ketoret, and it flies off the altar, so you have to put it on during the day, obviously. If it falls off the altar, you're supposed to put it back on. What if it falls off the altar at night? Are you allowed to put it on at night? That's what he says. You can put them on and leave them to burn, mi bo hashemesh, even after sunset. But then this has nothing to do with our topic at all. Because all this is saying is if it fell off the altar, you put it back on. It sounds like a very good answer. There's one problem with it. Okay, but before we say this, chen ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rav Yanai bepokin. Also, Rav Dimi came and said that Rabbi Yanai read this as poking. Our problem is going to be with Rabbi Yanai because it's going to contradict something else he said. Mi amar Rabbi Yani hachi, v'hamar Rabbi Yanai k'toret shepaka me'al gabei hamizbeach afilu katin sheba em machzerin ota. Rabbi Yanai himself said, what was on this list? Ketoret, kometz, and lavona. Now, ketoret, according to Rabbi Yanai, you don't actually put back on the altar if it falls off. Even if it's kratin, those are pieces of it, chunks of incense, you don't actually have to put them back on. So why would this braitot be saying about the incense that it has to go back on even at night? And here's a source for it. Tani Rabbi Chanina bar Miyumi b'debei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, for what Rabbi Yanai said about the incense, asher tochal ha'esh et ha'olah ala mizbeach. So specifically, it was talking about the fire on the mizbeach. From here, they get poking. It has to be completely the ikulei olah, things that are burned by the fire. Ata machzir. If they fell off, you have to put them back on. But only things that are like olah, ata machzir ikulei ketoret. They say ketoret is excluded from here. So to resolve this problem, they just say smei mikan ketoret. According to Rabbi Yanai, you have to take out the word ketoret here, and it's just kometz and lavona and not ketoret. Which, by the way, we've seen a lot of times, like pigol notar tameh, and sometimes one gets added by accident, or maaser, bechor, and pesach. Remember that we said, pesach really doesn't belong there. They just, often these three things go together. So maybe someone just accidentally, when they were memorizing it, added that one in, but it was by mistake. Okay, so we had two resolutions to the contradiction of this source against Rabbi Yochanan, and really two ways to understand this braitot that really did make a lot of sense, because it said the things that go during the day go at night. Okay, now we're going to finish with two questions here. I'm Rabbi Asi, and the third question we'll leave for tomorrow. Ki pashet Rabbi Eliezer ben Menachot bai hachi. When Rabbi Eliezer was learning Menachot, he asked the following question: Kometz shesidro v'sider alav et hamarachama. Usually we imagine altar, wood, korban. What if you took or kometz? What if you took the kometz and you put it straight on the altar and you put the wood on top of it? It's going to burn. But is that the normal way or not? Ma'u derech haktara b'kach or ein derech haktara b'kach? Do we say this is not the normal way of burning, or it is? This goes back to the previous sigur where we were saying, how do you burn things, right? Is this the way of burning that, the majority or just part of it, right? So same thing here. But different question, obviously. Teku, he doesn't have an answer. By Chizkiah, I asked the same question about the korbanot. And here we have a bit of a pasuk here. So Chizkiah asked, if arim shesidram v'sider alehem et maracha, you put the parts on the altar and then you put the maracha on top. Ma'u, do we say ala eitzim amarachmana? So the pasuk says, archu b'nei Aaron et hanitachim, they put all the parts on the altar. Al ha'eitzim asher ala esh asher ala mizbech. That sounds pretty clear. Goes on the wood that's on the altar. Sounds like if you flip the order, it's not going to work. Daf gale, it seemed you say, specifically that way. O Dilma, but he says, but maybe, tiktiv kra harina, there's a different pasuk. Asher tochala eshet ha'olah lemizbech. The fire eats the ola, which is on the altar. Meaning, it doesn't matter how it eats it, and then also it seems like the ola is al lemizbech. It sounds like the ola is directly on the altar. So maybe it works that way. So ibai hachiyav, maybe you could do it this way, maybe you could do it that way, and take it. We don't have an answer. Okay, so there's a further question, and then we'll finish that for the next Mishnah, a third question here. So, quick summary of our daf. We started with the nitmu'u, nevdu, right? It got lost, burnt, right? What if you have no shirayim left? Can you still burn the kometz? So this all depends on the machlok of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, and it matches so much that Rabbi Yehoshua there says, as long as you have a kazayit left. Also here, as long as you have a kazayit left. Okay, we had a whole discussion with him. Rav, did he only mean nitmu'u? We said no. In the end, he must have meant all three. Then we got into the shelo b'kli sharet and the machlok of Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, and that was summarized very well about the three opinions, and then the braitot that contradict the three opinions, or contradict some of the three opinions, and how we resolve some of the difficulties. Then we moved on to the pamayim, and the machloket, is it pamayim and even more than pamayim, or is it just 2 times, and what that machloket is based on. And then we finished with, at what point does the shirayim permit the kometz permit the shirayim, at what point in the burning process, and from there we brought a difficulty on one of the opinions, and from there we got into some questions about burning the kometz on the altar, if you switch the order of the wood or the kometz at the top. With that, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.